Friends, I just want to remind you before I get started here this morning that this is actually the third sermon in our series on our new Memphis First United Methodist values. And so the new Memphis First United Methodist values are: the Christ in me receives the Christ in you, the Christ in me responds to the Christ in you, and the Christ in us transforms the world. And so this week we're going to be talking about the receiving part, the Christ in me receiving the Christ in you. Ruth Coker-Burks at the University Hospital in Little Rock when she noticed a door in the hospital with a red bag on it. She recalled later that she watched as the nurses drew straws to see who would go in and take care of the patient inside. She eventually figured out that the person in the room was dying of AIDS. Even though she knew that you couldn't pass AIDS simply through physical contact, people were still deeply afraid of those infected with the AIDS virus, not least of which because many of them were gay. She snuck into the patient's room, and in there she discovered a skeletal young man desperately begging for his mother before he passed away. So Burks went out again to the nurse's desk and asked where his mother was. And the nurses smirked and said, "Oh, honey, his mother's not coming." She did manage, probably against the law, to get the nurses to give her the mother's phone number. She called the mother, and the nurses were right. The mother had no intention of coming to see her son, who she deemed already dead to her. So Burks returned to the young man's side and took his hand, stayed with him for 13 hours until he passed away. Then, with no family to claim his body, she decided to cremate and bury him at her own cost in her family plot, where she said, quote, "My beautiful little cemetery where my daddy and grandparents were buried, and they would watch out for him." The story in itself is already haunting, but here's what haunts me about it as a pastor. I wonder how many churches formed that young man's mother and her beliefs. I wonder how many sermons she heard that desensitized her to the experience of people who were different, to the experience of people who suffered different to her, to the point that she became alienated from her own. People are not naturally alienated from their biology. I guarantee you, as a pastor for 20 years, the churches consistently believe that we are more welcoming than we actually are. We believe we are open, and we believe we are loving, and we believe that we receive everyone. This is a church for everyone. Until the difference makes it a little more chaotic than we would prefer, or a little louder than we would like. Until the, quote, sin is outside our comfort zone and what we're used to. Until something about our preferences in music has to change. Until status makes us think that we could never understand somebody like that. Until the cost is too high. And then we put a red bag on the door and we draw straws to see who has to deal with them. Every church has someone it deems off limits, someone outside its ability to receive as a gift. Every church member has that addicted nephew you don't know what to do with. Every church has that undocumented family. Every church has that single parent who's got what seems like too many kids, and the kids are too loud, and they're interrupting service. Every church has young people that don't follow the rules, and they just don't get the respect you should have. Every church has that person who votes differently than me, and every church has that church member that just embarrasses the rest of us. People we draw straws to see who has to deal with them, people we avoid conversations with, people we weaponize our theology against, people we label as projects or problems or issues, and it is easier always to label someone than to receive them as a gift. It is easier to categorize someone as other than me than to recognize Christ behind the red bag. In a silly way, churches remind me of that Diversity Day episode of The Office. See, Michael is trying to celebrate diversity in the office, and he plays this little game with people, and he thinks that he is celebrating inclusion, and he is so proud of himself. But the moment Toby from HR suggests, Michael, you might be hurting people, he explodes. And does anybody remember what he says? This is an environment of welcoming, and you should get the bleep out of here. My wife can't watch The Office because Michael makes her squirm. And honestly, I get it. There is something that is painfully revealing about watching someone who believes he is progressive while being completely unaware of the way he wounds people episode after episode after episode. But for those of us who can stomach it, Michael Scott offers, I think, an occasional uncomfortable insight into church. The harm that has been done in the name of godliness. All the lives that have been destroyed in the name of, I believe the right thing. All the wars waged in the name of Christian peace. Somehow I think the absurdity of The Office isn't really all that absurd, is it? He thinks that he is receptive. He thinks that he is hospitable. He did not want to recognize when those differences might disrupt him, disrupt his self-perception, or his preferences. And if I can just speak to white progressives for a moment, this is a massive problem for us. Because we think we're the good guys. We're not racist like the other whites. We're not image of our own self-righteousness. Self-image is challenged makes us incapable of receiving God's gift in the other person, whose very identity challenges ours always as a gift. We are open the way we believe we are welcoming, the way we believe that we receive others while conditioning that welcome on agreeing with me. Having the same cultural or class or racial assumptions as me, living like me and in the way I live. But what if the American church since the 1980s and even today has been missing Christ because we have convinced ourselves that while we are welcoming, we are subtly and overtly signaling to others that they do not, in fact, belong here? What if the young man behind the red bag was not a problem to be managed or an issue to be debated, but the presence of Christ to be received? What if she acted out of the Christ alive in her? What if she recognized that Christ in that young man before she even registered his diagnosis or his sexuality or his perceived sin? Not simply that he died without his mother. We are confessing something profound and I think utterly countercultural. To me, it will be a problem if this just turns into a slogan. We are confessing that the distance between me and the person I fear, the person I hate, the person I dislike, the person I feel uncomfortable with. The distance between me and the person I fear is infinitely smaller than the distance between either of us and God. Let me make this concrete. Imagine in your mind the most fundamentalist, Baptist, moral legalist, King James only, gay-hating, black-hating, long skirt-wearing Karen. Imagine that person. And what I want you to realize, and what I think this church's job to do is to help her realize, is that the distance is less distance than the difference between either of them and God. You are more like your worst enemy than you are like God. Elon Musk is more like the poorest person in the slums of India than either of them is like God. That mother was more like her, quote, sinner son than either of them was like God. But what God has done is said over and over and over and over that if you are to recognize and receive my presence in the world, it will be in the most vulnerable. The people you don't want to welcome, the people you don't want to receive, the people you want to draw lines in the sand and say, you have to stay over there. I don't get to reject you. You're more like me than God is like me. Therefore, if I can't stand your otherness, there is no way I'm going to be able to stand God's otherness. There's no way. God is more other to me than who could ever be. And therefore, receiving each other as gifts in our difference is a requirement for receiving God in God's utter difference. This is exactly why Jesus says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And the second greatest commandment is just like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. See, all of us share creatureliness. None of us share divinity, which means that when the Christ in me receives the Christ in you, that reception is not a superior being tolerating an inferior being. It is the image of God bowing before the image of God. It is the transcendent God choosing to meet God's own reflection in the people that we would rather avoid, we don't want to talk to, and we definitely don't want to touch. And I think that changes everything about church, and I think it changes everything about the way we think about our existence for the next 200 years. When we're talking about Christ, receiving Christ in each other, we're talking about something much bigger than just this recognition. For this church to be on this block for another 200 years, this is our 200-year anniversary. For those of you who are visiting with us, this year is our 200th anniversary. We're celebrating it. And in order to pass on a legacy that can go for 200 more years, here's what we need to realize. I don't just get to receive you. My receiving of you is a model for the people who are coming after us. Our children are going to know whether this church is actually living its values or just talking about its values. You don't think the children will know? Your children already know. Look around this room. Look around this room. It's not enough for us to be a simple cultural organization anymore. It's not enough for us to be a club that's about living our morality. That's just saying, well, we're moral, and so if you're not moral like we're moral, then you're over there. That's not what this is about, and it cannot be if we're going to be here for 200 more years. What would it look like instead of our church, or our children rejecting the church or even enduring having to worship with you on Christmas when they come home? What if they were excited because they were like, I don't know if I agree with all that or not, but those people live what they say. I'm telling you right now, The church in America is destroying the faith of the next generation in this moment. Destroying it. I think we will be very lucky if we survive it. There are these people right now that are super excited. I'm just going for free. I have a captive audience. You'll endure me. There are these people right now that are celebrating that more young men in Gen Z are attending church. Have you seen these stats? Well, first of all, they're not. What's actually happening is less Gen Z women are attending than previous generations. Sociologists ask them in surveys, do you agree that the man is the head of the house and the woman should submit? They say yes. Where did they get that? Their churches and their podcasters. People like Jordan Peterson that their pastors quote. They're coming back to church because the church is promising them social power. That's not a fulfillment of the gospel. That is a denial of the gospel. And when those kids are not 19, 20, they will wake up one day and realize that the church deceived them. Hopefully. That's the best case scenario. The worst case scenario is they actually stay in church and try to reshape the world in that image. I think we have to have a serious conversation in this church and in the broader church about the legacy that we're actually passing on to our children and ask, is this a legacy where not only our children receive, but children are taught to receive? Are we teaching our children to recognize Christ in people who are different? Like a year ago, I went to this United Methodist conversation. It was like, come be a part of the healing. And I was like, no, I just like to complain. But I went, and it was a conversation about metrics and how we measure success in our churches. And I was getting frustrated because in the course of the conversation over all these days, like they were just talking about like the same old metrics, like butts and seats. Is your church growing? Do you think our church has failed because we haven't grown numerically, right? Like this is the conversation. And I'm like, this is dumb. And so finally, like after 2 or 3 days sitting in it, I was just like, look, I don't know that I know what the right metrics are, but here's what I know. I know that if young men grow up in my church and they don't become fascists, I feel a little bit like we were successful. Okay? Like, that's like the lowest bar. But I want for us more than just the low bar metrics. I want us to be a community where our young men know how to receive and surrender to the presence of God, including the presence of God in people who are vastly different than them. So after that first young man, the hospital began calling on Ruth Coker-Burks whenever a patient arrived who was dying of AIDS and had no family who were willing to sit with him. She became the one who stayed, the one who received these young men. She talks in interviews about how she made promises to 40 bury them in her family cemetery. And here's where the children part comes in. She said, quote, "My daughter would go with me. She had a little spade and I had post hole diggers and I would dig the hole and she would help me and I'd bury them. Have a do-it-yourself funeral. Honor of handing them back to their friends and to God. Handing them back to God. That is what it means to receive someone as a gift. To understand that no matter how other they feel to you, they are not an interruption to your faith or your worship service. They are an encounter with Christ. Your calling is not to fix, it is not to manage, it is not to debate. Your calling is to receive. It is Christ in you, recognizing the Christ in them. And together you are returned to God more whole than you were without each other. That is why we gather at this table. A church of difference brought into unity by a Christ who is recognizing himself in each other. That is what this table is. This table is practice learning to receive each other.